Okay, so now we're recording. Welcome everybody again. Today we're really pleased to introduce this lecture by Amandine Crespy. Amandine is an associate professor of political science at the Université Libre de Bruxelles, the ULB in Brussels. She's affiliated there with the European Studies Institute, and she is also the vice director of the Center for Studies of Political Life. I'm translating from the French and hopefully it comes out okay. She's also a visiting professor and teaches courses at the College of Europe in Bruges. And she is a very well-known scholar of Europe and social policy in particular. She is a frequent contributor and commentator on European Union politics in both Belgium and in France. Some of her recent books are Governance and Politics in the Post-Crisis European Union, published last year with Cambridge University Press. Also the European Social Question, Tackling Key Controversies, which is out this year with Agenda. And she's also the author of Welfare Markets in Europe, the Democratic Challenge of European Integration. So we're really pleased to have Professor Crespy with us today. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. Professor Crespy will give her lecture, and then of course, as usual, we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. So if you would like to ask a question, please feel free to indicate your name, or if you're having internet connection issues, your question using the chat box. So I'll use the chat box to establish the list of people who have questions to ask, and then I will call and invite you to unmute yourself and perhaps turn your camera on at the end of the lecture. If everybody can just make sure they keep their microphones off, that would be very much appreciated. And without further ado, I'll hand over to Professor Crespy. Over to you. Thank you, Amandine.
Okay, thank you so much, Louisa, for the nice introduction, and above all, thank you for the invitation to speak today. I'm very pleased, and by the way, I would like to apologize for next week. I hope this was of no inconvenience for anyone, and that everybody who wanted to join last week is also able to do so this week. And it's a great pleasure to be discussing Social Europe with you today. So let me share my presentation with you and go for the slideshow. So you should be able to see my PowerPoint. If it's not the case, please scream as I'm just seeing my presentation right now. So the title of this presentation is Social Europe Irrelevant, Catching Up or Dangerous? And I want to discuss with you why various observers, various citizens, or various scholars are arguing in very different way about social Europe, and why this is so, and how we can explain all this. So before I come to these controversies, I want to start with a few definitions, perhaps. Well, what is it really that we call social Europe? So, of course, social Europe is a very polysemic notion. So when we, some people understand, you know, that it's of course about social policy making at the EU level, but it's not necessarily obvious or easy to define the boundaries of this realm of social Europe. For instance, should, you know, education and culture be included in the realm of social Europe? Is health part of it? So depending on the studies or the books or the perspectives taken by different scholars, you see also different perimeters, different definitions of what social Europe is. Some colleagues talk about the social dimension of European integration. And by this, they mean also how the single market has developed over time a social dimension and flanking social policy. Social Europe also covers what we call the socioeconomic governance of the EU, of the European Union. And here as well, the boundaries can be understood in different ways. Some people would include, the economic and monetary union in there, because obviously I also use that term socioeconomic governance because it doesn't make too much sense to talk about social policy in an isolated fashion from economic policy. So it's the social and the economic together. But perhaps even more interestingly, social Europe is a normative notion. So, it's not only descriptive. And there's a number of deep and interesting questions behind that notion. And one of them is, for instance, and that's a question that I ask to my students for exams or even in class a lot of time, is there such a thing as a European social model? So here, of course, we're talking about centralization versus decentralization of social policy. The idea that the EU is unfolding or is elaborating its own social system, but that, of course, we have a lot of different social systems which are inherited from history and from culture. In Europe, we have the Anglo-Saxon liberal model, we have the more continental conservative or Bismarckian model, we have the Scandinavian model. Some colleagues have also, asked whether they should be a specific Southern European model. Actually, a colleague of yours, Maurizio Ferreira, is very famous for coming up with this idea. A second set of questions behind this notion of social model relates to the nature of that model. So if the EU is gaining competences in social policy, if it's somehow developing its own model, its own social policy, what is the nature of that very model, right? And here we're talking more about market versus capital, the very, of course, key cleavage in Europe. So is this model rather encouraging more the commodification of social activities, of social services, of workers, or is it, on the contrary, fostering the decommodification or a recommodification? So where lies the balance between the market versus, sorry, and I'm just seeing here a bit confused that there's obviously a mistake in this slide. So it shouldn't say market versus capital, but capital versus workers, or market versus society, if you want. So sorry about that for the mistake. So the market versus society. So is European social policy encouraging more recommodification or decommodification of social activities? And from a politics point of view, very clearly the idea of building a social Europe or of reaching a social Europe has been a very typical motto for the left, for unions and for social democrats. Social Europe has become a very, very recurring leitmotif and theme that you can find in a lot of manifestos from various social democratic parties across Europe. And so I'll say a bit more about that later on, but some argue it's actually a failed political project that the left has supported, but which has never really come to an age, so to speak. So when we're trying to assess, what social Europe is, there's always this assessment depend on the gap that people see or do not see between what the EU is actually doing in actual fact, so the policy instruments, the policy areas that the EU is using or in which it is taking action, but also the more normative question of what the EU should actually do from a more normative or idealistic point of view, if you want. And all the answers and all the assessments and all the arguments which we will discuss in this presentation actually follow from the relationship between these two questions. What is the EU doing and what should it do? So if I'm now not starting from a very, let's say, ideal idea of what the EU should do, the least we can do is start looking at the good old treaties. And why? Because the treaties state the objectives of the EU. In this case here in Article 3 in the Treaty on the European Union. And so in that way, let's say, ideal notion of what the EU should do is not coming from my own assessment or from a subjective assessment, but it's coming from the very objectives that the European Union and that Europeans or European decision makers have given for themselves, right? And what stands in the treaties is always a compromise, of course, various different political opinions and currents and so on. So what do we find in this Article 3? We find that the very first objective is the market. The Union shall establish an internal market, and it shall work for the sustainable development. So here we see this notion of sustainable development of Europe based on balanced economic growth and price stability. So we find a lot of economic notions. And then this fairly interesting and slightly ambiguous notion of a highly competitive social market economy. So here already, we find in this quite famous notion of competitive social market economy, the political compromise between, let's say, the neoliberals and the social democrats in Europe, to give a very broad picture of two opposing camps. This competitive social market economy should aim at full employment and social progress and a high level of protection and improvement of the quality of the environment. Then there's something about technology, but in terms of social objectives, there's quite a number of them. It shall combat social exclusion and discrimination and shall promote social justice and protection, equality between women and men, solidarity between generations, and protection of the rights of the child. It shall promote economic, social, and territorial cohesion and solidarity among member states. So I have put in bold those objectives which really interest us in this lecture in terms of social policy. I could have put also equality between women and men, of course, in bold. So we see that the European Union European decision makers rather, have set quite a range of ambitious or fairly ambitious social policy objectives. Trying to, going back to this article and trying to perhaps have a more analytical categorization or a more analytical view of what these objectives are, I would distinguish between three types of, I could say social justice, but I'd rather use the term cohesion, social cohesion, because the idea of justice is a very philosophical term. There are a lot of interesting books and so on, but I'm not doing philosophy here, so we will not discuss, what is social justice and what should social justice be at the European level. But social and territorial cohesion is a bit of a more operational way to conceive of social justice in terms of limiting the degree of inequality among people and among territories. So that's why I pick usually this term. And so trying to put some order in there. I would argue that we can distinguish between three types of social cohesion. First, national social cohesion and how the EU should help to maintain or to create social cohesion within European societies and states. So there are also other articles in the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union stating that the EU should promote a high level of welfare and a high level of social protection, across the board for all Europeans. So here we see this is about social cohesion within European societies and states. But when the EU says that it should promote solidarity among its members and among its territories, very clearly here, the article is referring to international social cohesion between European societies and states. We've had, a lot of crucial debates over the past few months about this particular type of social cohesion and the notion of redistribution of common resources across territories. And thirdly, there is a type of social cohesion that concerns all Europeans, transnational, I would call it transnational social cohesion between Europeans and citizens across societies and states, because we're not only national citizens, we're also European citizens. We're also enjoying a number of pan-European social rights. And the EU also has the ambition not only to combat inequalities within European societies, but also between them and also across the board. So the key question which I'm looking at here and which arise from these three types is really that of the role of the EU. And there's an ongoing controversy already for a long time, but which has become more vivid over the past 10 years or past 15 years. Between and after the 2008-2010 financial crisis. And this controversy is about how to evaluate the role of the EU with regard to those three types of social cohesion. Is the EU really fostering those three types of social cohesion, or is it on the contrary undermining social cohesion across the board? Before I start with the outline, I'd like to tell you that you should really feel free to interrupt or ask a question at any point if something is unclear or if you want to ask about something. So if there are any question or remarks at this stage about the introduction, don't hesitate to interrupt. Okay, if not, I will start with addressing these three perspectives on social Europe and how can we explain and why is it that some people argue it's actually irrelevant, others argue it's too weak but it's catching up, and a third group of scholars yet will argue, well, social Europe is actually a dangerous notion for a number of reasons. And after we've examined those three perspectives, I will look into what to do, depending on the type of assessment that you're doing, how to go forward and what should the EU be doing or no longer be doing. And here I'll submit three scenarios about what to do. Perhaps a small reflexive word. You see here a picture of Wolfgang Strick. He's an eminent political economist, and over the past few years, he's turned into a very critical scholar of European integration and of the role of the EU in social policy in particular. And he's also not throwing anathema, but questioning the normative position of scholars themselves, as he wrote, for instance, in a recent article that ideally idealizing Europe and European policy is much easier than assessing its realities, which has become a domain for insider specialists. Most of them tend to be pro-European. So he's here, questioning the positive assessments of social Europe by a range of scholars in European studies. And I think that what follows actually contradicts a little bit his idea that all scholars of European studies and of European social policy are pro-European. I think, on the contrary, there's a lot of controversy, and that's what I'm trying to show in this lecture. So first of all, there are grounds, or a number of scholars see grounds to argue that social Europe is actually irrelevant. Why? Because if you look at the treaties, the European Union has only scattered and weak competencies in the field of social policy. Social policy is clearly not a strong, policy field for the EU, like you could say of competition policy or single market policies. So, as I'm sure you're aware, the European Union is nowhere near a European welfare state, not only to say that this would be a desirable objective. And the main reason for that is that it has very few resources. The budget, before this new budget and the recovery package, the budget has been for a very, very long time stabilized around 1% of European GDP. So the EU, unlike national states, is doing very little redistribution. EU social policy making actually relies to a very large extent on regulation. And even then, you could argue this regulation and social regulation is fairly weak. If we want to have a bit of a more historical and political look back into the history of social Europe, we see a very complex relationship between social Europe and the left. Why concentrated here on the left? Simply because, the left has the, forces which are supposed to defend and to promote the expansion of welfare states, above all. So very, of course, extremely broad brushed, we could say that, the trade unions in particular were part of the federalist movement, which very quickly already at the at the end of the 50s became very critical of the Treaty of Rome and of its liberal, its liberal nature, and the fact that it relies so heavily on liberalization and on the four freedoms. And we see a withdrawal of a number of national left-wing parties, socialist parties, and also the unions onto the national realm, and them being increasingly critical of European unification, relying, in fact, essentially on liberal ideas. Not only, but still trying to advocate for a social Europe, but not really seeing it unfolding. And then in the course of the 1980s, we see a pro-Europe conversion of a lot of socialist or social democratic parties, which have been very critical of the European economic community. But what we also see in the course of the 1990s and in the 2000s is those parties precisely claiming wanting to build a social Europe, a supranational social market economy, but actually failing to do so in a fairly painful way. So this admittedly crowded slide, I mean, we don't need to perhaps stay very long here, but I still wanted to show you how the competencies of the EU are circumscribed in the treaty themselves. The key provisions in social policy are located in a Title 10 on social policy. And the important point to bear in mind here is that the treaty distinguished between shared competencies in Article 153, in which the Union may legislate, and you see in the second column here the policy issues on which the EU may legislate. So it's all of them in this box, apart from G and K, which are in gray. So most importantly, we have here issues related to health and safety at work and working conditions. And you see also social security and social protection, but as the star indicates here, the Council still decides by unanimity, which of course makes it difficult to agree on European policies. And then some specific issues relating to information and consultation of workers, conditions of employment for third country nationals, and also equality between men and women. So it's not to argue that those things are not important, they are, but obviously, you know, some very, very key issues of working conditions and social policy, especially everything that relates to pay, is completely outside of the realm of the competence of the European Union. So Article 153, that's the shared competences. I leave this for afterwards. And then we have Article 156, where here the EU only has supporting competencies. And what does this mean? It means that EU may not legislate. So here, this is what we refer to as coordination. So the EU can act as a laboratory for exchanging ideas, for trying and benchmark, you know, what the member states are doing in social policy, but it can actually not use legally binding constraining means to enforce European or policy from the European level. Article 152 to 155 relate to the European social dialogue, which is about the consultations and the agreements between representatives of employers and workers at European level. But in all honesty, looking at the specific provisions, they're not laid out in a very clear way in the treaties. So I think that the legal categories that are used in various respects introduce a bit of confusion. And so perhaps to make things a bit more clear, I would like to tell you that European social policy can be broken down into four key domains. The first is social regulation, which relates to the single market and especially workers' rights when they move from one country to the other. The second large domain is the European social dialogue, which I just mentioned, which seeks to regulate relations between capital and work. The third domain is that of redistribution through funds in order to tackle territorial imbalances. And finally, we have the coordination of national policies through which the EU is trying to encourage the modernization, whatever that means, and however this may be defined, the modernization of welfare states. So let me say a few more things about each of these domains and why a lot of observers would conclude that European social policy, you know, compared to what national states are doing, is at the end of the day fairly irrelevant and very secondary. So like I said before, in terms of regulation, the EU can only regulate about health and safety, anti-discrimination, and then a few specific issues relating to information and consultation or the rights of migrant workers. But the bulk of social policy, social security and pay are outside of its scope of action. Furthermore, a number of scholars, including Paolo Graziano and Miriam Hatlap, but also scholars from the European Trade Union Institute in Brussels, Philippe Pochet and Christophe de Graes, they also have, studies showing that clearly over time, and certainly especially over the past 15, 20 years, since the early 2000s, we've seen a decline of social regulation. Not so much a decline in the number of regulations adopted, but a decline in their nature, in their innovative nature. So the EU has updated a lot of old regulations and directives, but not really launched too many new projects. And one of the reasons for that is that it's difficult to argue. So this is what Fritz Schaap in political economy calls the joint decision trap. Simply the fact that member states have diverging models, they have diverging preferences. With enlargement, they've become also more numerous, and that all that makes it very difficult to reach qualified majority, or when it's required, actually unanimity in the council to agree on new regulations. As far as the European social dialogue is concerned, here the key procedure, which was introduced into the Maastricht Treaty through the so-called social protocol, actually equates to a kind of delegation of the regulatory or the legislative competence to the social partners. So if the social partners agree on a certain issue, so for instance, we've had an agreement on telework, we've had an agreement on part-time work, then the Commission, and much more so the Council, will simply pick up on that agreement and turn it into a regulatory, into a legally binding regulation. So this sounds great. This was very innovative back in 1993. The problem is that this very procedure has only produced a handful of binding texts. Very few of them, actually about 5 across sectors, and a few more if you look at sectoral agreements. But across the board, we've seen over time, especially employers' reticence to engage in legally binding agreements at EU level. So many critical scholars, actually there's on that point quite a consensus to argue that the European social dialogue is a complete failure, a complete attempt to reproduce neo-corporatism at European level. And that it really is completely residual and insufficient to actually regulate the functioning of the economy, regulate the industrial relations, and that as a political process, it served more to ensure the support of both workers and employers to the EU integration project. If we're now moving on to redistribution through funds, the EU has cohesion policy, which precisely aims at tackling territorial gaps and differences in socioeconomic development. And here we're especially interested in the European Social Fund, which has existed since the 60s and has represented approximately 10% of the EU budget, as a whole, of the whole EU budget. Well, is it working? Is cohesion policy and the European Social Fund, are they really achieving their objectives in terms of reducing inequalities between social groups and territories? Well, there's a lot of studies about that, and it's in fact extremely difficult to assess the impact of the EU cohesion policy and of the EU funds. Because it's very difficult to disentangle the impact of the funds from the effect of, broader contextual factors, especially, of course, growth rates or other policies that regional or national governments are conducting. But there have been a number of critiques made vis-à-vis social policy, for instance, that it's too bureaucratic, that it's being instrumentalized, that occasionally there has been misuse of money. For instance, at the moment, there are quite some discussions about how the funds are serving to feed into corruption networks in countries such as Hungary in particular, which of course is part of the motivation for the EU to put this, rule of law conditionality on the distribution of the funds. So especially the recovery package, but that also covers the whole of the EU budget and including the European Social Fund. So the critique here is that if we look at, like Dorothee Bohler and other colleagues have done for our textbook on social politics and governance, they've looked at the gaps and all the indicators in terms of socioeconomic development between the wealthy core of the EU in continental Europe and in Northern Europe, and the peripheries of the EU, especially in the south and in east and in the Baltic region and so on. And in the grand scheme of things, it's difficult to argue that cohesion policy has reached the objectives, because we see that in fact some of the gaps have even become wider than they used to be 10 or 15 years ago before the financial and debt crisis. So, so here, also it's a lot of money for the EU budget, but when you compare it to national budgets, the EU funds, it's on the grand scheme of things, not that much money. And finally, looking at the coordination of national policies, here really we're in a realm of soft law. So through procedures such as the open method of coordination, the EU is trying to encourage, to call on governments to reform their welfare state, to make them more efficient, more sustainable, and more performant. But across the board, let's say compliance has been, we can't even talk about compliance in the sense that member states are not supposed to comply. There's no legally binding regulation. It's a much more bottom-up discussion for comparing various models and various reforms of welfare states. But more interestingly, what research shows is that clearly soft coordination is instrumentalized by national elites to pursue their own agenda. So they would, let's say, comply or follow the recommendations of the EU only insofar as it is in tune with what they wanted to do anyway. Sometimes EU recommendations act, and this has been actually the lot in Italy, there's a whole literature about that, act as an incentive and as a legitimization tools for those domestic, those national decision makers who wanted to pass painful reforms, politically costly reforms like pension reforms or some recalibration of the welfare state, some retrenchment, but didn't necessarily have the political resources to do it. And so when the EU advocates some reforms, there's a way to use that European injunction as a kind of legitimizing tools or to argue that the constraint is coming from outside, from Europe. Any questions or comments so far from your side? Really don't hesitate to take the floor at any point. Okay, so let me go on. So perhaps a more sophisticated way to formulate this argument is not to say that social Europe is completely irrelevant, but that it's in fact, it cannot really be compared to national social policy because it is by definition very different in nature. It was not historically conceived to temper or to correct market failures, but actually to allow it. It was always an add-on to the single market to allow, for instance, one of the very few policy issues which developed in the 60s was the coordination of social security for workers moving from one country to the other. So this was really to only make mobility possible and to coordinate in what should become a pan-European market, but also labor market with mobile labor force. Jean-Claude Barbier, a French scholar of social protection, argued that the EU anyway will never have, the social and the cultural roots and, in fact, the legitimacy that national member states enjoy. And that this is another, point to say that European social policy is very different in nature. Another interesting metaphor. So you could say social policy was always an add-on, but Sasha Garben, for instance, argued that social policy was institutionally and legally displaced. It was displaced from this Title 10, which is the title on social policy in the treaty, to the realm of economic and fiscal policy, especially with coordination. It was also, to a large extent, displaced from the legislative terrain, where it is normally up to the legislator, namely the Council and the European Parliament together, to decide on new directives, to the judicial terrain, because the Court of Justice of the European Union has played such an important role in driving the ups and downs, the going forward and going backwards of European social policy. More broadly, a number of us have argued that social policy has been, and remains subordinated to two economic imperatives, one being competitiveness, the other being fiscal discipline, not only for institutional or legal reasons, but also to a great extent for ideological reasons. So all in all, social Europe may not be completely irrelevant, but it is certainly a secondary policy area in the sense that it's subordinated, it's depending on other objectives. I'm now moving on to the second type of argument about social Europe, the idea that social Europe, okay, it's not perfect, it's weak, it's not performing, it's not doing everything it should do, but it's actually catching up if you look at how it's changing over time. So if you take a long time perspective, you see that there has been a continuous development of the EU policies, instruments, competencies. Every time that there was a new treaty, this is arguable for the very last treaties, but at least, some new small competencies and provisions were added into the treaties. So social Europe is catching up because it's developing incrementally as new issues, as new functional needs appear, as we see that the interdependency between European societies is increasing, then we see the EU doing more and more. And the example I wanted to give here is something that you may or may not know, which is called the European Employment Initiative. Perhaps a term that's more familiar to you would be the youth guarantee, which is actually the main instrument that the Youth Employment Initiative is funding. It was set up back in 2012 at the time when youth unemployment was really skyrocketing, or had skyrocketed, especially in South European countries as a result of the recession, as a result of the financial and debt crisis. So this youth guarantee was adopted through a council recommendation. This means that it is not completely legally constraining from the member states. And it should have been set up in those regions where youth unemployment was higher than 25% in 2012. So actually the youth guarantee was implemented, or was supposed to be implemented everywhere, but the EU money would help those regions with unemployment rates higher than 25%. And the idea behind the youth guarantee is to really help the young people who are not in education or in employment, nor in employment, nor in training. So this is this NEET category, to help them to find a way out of this situation and to not be completely inactive, to find either an apprenticeship or a traineeship or a job placement, or to start some kind of new training, further education, to re-qualify or qualify, etc. So this was an interesting example of, how the EU could expand and initiate new things, although not sometimes with a lot of resources, or not always in a legally binding fashion.
We did have one question in the box for you, Amandine.
Yes, please. Yeah.
Information from Anna Di Palma.
Mm-hmm.
Anna?
Yeah, do you see me? No, you now see me. Hi, Professor. Thank you for your presentation. It's really, really interesting, and this is something that I would like to focus on in my future research.
Okay.
I was asking if you could go, please, to the previous slides about the 4 realms.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I was thinking about the relationship between social cohesion and these 4 realms, in 2 ways. The first way, do you think that all these realms contribute to social policy, and is there a difference in the way each group contribute to social policy? And also from an ex post perspective, is there a way to measure or evaluate social cohesion and the contribution of these policies for social cohesion? Also, I don't know, by employing an indicator that can better operationalize social cohesion.
So your question focuses on social cohesion only, so on the third line, right? Or not? The first part of your question was actually concerning the 4 areas, right?
Yeah, because this is exactly what I cannot really understand. If I'm not mistaken, we are evaluating how Europe is contributing or not, whether it's contributing or not to social cohesion. But then should we consider all these 4 groups, or only some of them? And then also the second question is about how you operationalize social cohesion, or how do you measure the contribution of policies to social cohesion?
Thank you very much for the question. So it helps me clarify what I'm trying to do here with this very crowded slide. In this slide, I try to stylize, if you want, to distinguish between what I think are the 4 building blocks of social Europe. And, you know, when people talk about social Europe and make arguments about is it good, is it bad, is it efficient or not, sometimes they only focus on one or two of those realms. And if you look at the treaties, if you want to talk about social European policy in general, then you should consider those four building blocks. Okay, so those four were for me a way to show you the various facets of social Europe, which relate on different policy instruments, on different modes of governance, ranging from legally binding regulation to non-binding coordination to you know, neo-corporatist social dialogue and through the funds. Okay, so I hope this answers your first question. And then regarding your question about the methodology, well, this is a very interesting, and that's where the challenge lies. So for each of these building blocks, scholars in their studies have come up with different ways to assess the effectiveness, you know, either being by the number of regulations or by their effectiveness or by the outcome. So, of course, there's generally two ways in social science. You can either look at what certain authorities are doing. So you can look at the policy instruments themselves. Are they good? Are they strong? Are they legally binding? Are they accompanied by a lot of resources to help implement the policies and so on? But you can also look at the outcomes. You know, what is the impact? At the end of the day, once the policies have been implemented, what are we left with? Have the objectives which were set, have they been achieved? So if we now focus on your second question, which was relating to redistribution through the funds and cohesion policy, that's one of my arguments. Unfortunately, it's very, very difficult. So the European Commission issues a report, an evaluation report at the end of every budget cycle. So the EU multi-annual financial framework is adopted for 7 years. And at the end of each period, so now, if it's not already done, but I think in the course of this year, 2020, we'll have the evaluation report for the 2014-2020 period. And sometimes they even have midterm evaluation reports. Of course, I mean, one should not be cynical, but one shouldn't be naive either. I mean, in the reports of the European Commission, everything is always pretty great. You know, they focus on the policies themselves. They you know, show examples and lists of projects that the EU money has supported for integrating, you know, migrants into the labor market, for integrating former inmates into the labor market, for funding the youth guarantee and help young people to qualify or requalify, etc. On the other hand, of course, you also have independent expertise and academic research. And here it's very complicated. So you can try and disentangle various factors. You know, if you see that in a certain territory, there's some catching up. And here the key example would be Ireland. You know, Ireland was considered a success story of European integration, but also of cohesion policy. Ireland has received a lot of funds and has known actually a very important catch-up process in terms of socioeconomic development. The thing is that, you know, a lot of studies and a lot of observers argued that this was not so much due to EU funds, but that this was more due to Ireland's aggressive fiscal policy, to have for example, a very low corporate base, corporate tax, to attract foreign direct investments, and especially at a certain point in time, American foreign investments, and that this had really been the driver of the Irish development. In this chapter that I referred to by Dorothee Bohle and her colleagues, they look at the southern and the eastern periphery, and they see that some catching up has taken place, no doubt about it, but that it's just not enough. You know, you still see, and especially the 2008-2010 recession and financial and debt crisis has put a halt to this catching up process. So here, if we look at the outcomes, not only at what the EU is doing, but in fact the outcomes, it's still very, very unsatisfactory. And we see clearly this gap between the wealthy core in the EU and the struggling peripheries. Have I answered your questions, Anna?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, okay, excellent. Time is flying.
Yeah, we probably need to leave space for more questions and answers, look at wrapping up in about 10, maximum 15 minutes with the lecture part.
Okay, wow, I have to be very quick, 15 minutes. Okay. All right. All right, so let me, yes, I'm still sharing. Okay, let me go back full screen and end with the side of the argument that social Europe is catching up. What we see actually is different phases. We see phases of market offensive followed by catching up in the social realm. So for instance, we've seen you know, from 2004 to 2009, under the presidency of José Manuel Barroso in the Commission, pro-market offensive, also from the court. And then after the crisis, what Robert Hyman called austeritarianism, with a very strong focus on fiscal discipline. And Jonathan Zeitlin and Bart Van Aert put forward this meanwhile quite famous argument that since then, since 2014, we've seen a catching up, a socialization of the European semester. So I had a whole slide here to explain what the European semester is, but I won't do that. I just want to say that the European semester serves to coordinate fiscal policy, macroeconomic policy, and social policy in one same framework, which is an heteroclite, an eclectic framework with both hard law provisions and soft law provisions. So it's a bit confusing and not necessarily very clear. But Jonathan Zeitlin and Bart Van Aert have argued that this process, which is aggregating all these areas, had known an important degree of socialization because social actors had become more and more involved over time, but also social concerns within the European semester had become more, much more visible over time as well. Actually, what we see is that social Europe is catching up because it is a ground of political battles. On the one hand, we have economic-oriented actors, that's DG ECFIN, Economic and Financial Affairs within the European Commission, that's the ECOFIN Council for Economic and Financial Affairs, employers gathered within Business Europe, and a number of member states with a pro-market mindset. And on the other hand, we have the more socially oriented actors, for instance, DG EMPL for Employment and Social Affairs within the Commission, the EBSCO Council, that's the acronym for the Council for Employment and Social Affairs. We have a number of civil society organizations here. You see the logo, for instance, of the Social Platform, which is a very, very broad umbrella organization which represents hundreds of social NGOs, and the ETUC, the European Trade Union Confederation. In terms of the legal politics, the court has been a very, very key actor driving social Europe, but it's been versatile over time. So historically, it's been a generator of new pan-European rights, especially in the field of non-discrimination. And I just want to very quickly say something about Elian Vogelski, because coming from the ULB, it would be a shame for me not to mention this former colleague of mine. She was a law professor at ULB, but also a feminist activist. And she actually sued the national airline Sabena in the 70s with two cases, two affairs, Gabrielle Defresne in 71 and 76, on the basis of the Article 118 of the Treaty of Rome, which stipulates that there should be equal pay between men and women. And this article had never been used. And Elian Vogelski used this article to sue the Sabena twice. And eventually, the court spoke in her favor and in favor of Gabrielle Defresne. She was actually a hair hostess who was being fired by the company because she was being too old, and men could work much longer at the time. Of course, this was very sexist. From this point on, very clearly, equality and equal pay between men and women, gender equality at work became a very cornerstone of the EU legal order. So, social Europe is catching up after authoritarianism. Italian colleagues, for instance, Francesco Corti and Patrick Vezin, argued that since 2014-2016, we see clearly a renewal of the social policy agenda of the EU. And this is relating to the adoption back in 2017 of the so-called European Pillar of Social Rights, which is a catalog of 20 key principles organized in 3 chapters about equal opportunities and access to the labor market. Second chapter, fair working conditions, and thirdly, social protection and inclusion. And this European Pillar of Social Rights should be implemented through hard law and regulation. And you see here on the right of the slide, the list of the new regulations which were adopted in connection with the pillar over the past few years, but also through soft coordination, so implementation of the pillar, also through soft coordination. And very, very recently, last week, the European Commission adopted an action plan to revive European social dialogue under the pillar. So whether all that will bear fruit or not is still, to be seen, but there has been already a number of directives. I would point especially to this last one, which is still being debated, which has been submitted in October, directive proposal on minimum wages. So that's, I said earlier that pay was outside of the realm, and that's controversial actually, whether the EU should be legislating, but it has submitted this directive to constrain member states to have a clear methodology to set the level of minimum wages, which should be a fair level. Finally, social Europe is dangerous. That's what many scholars have argued. And here you see a picture of Fritz Schaaf, another German political economist who famously argued that the EU cannot be a social market economy. And there's actually a whole German school revolving around Fritz Schaaf, but also Martin Höppner, Klaus Offer, who is a sociologist, Wolfgang Streeck, whom I already mentioned earlier, and Georg Mens. And those people say, well, the EU socio-economic regime is fundamentally asymmetric. It's biased towards market making for institutional reasons. And it has profoundly debased national systems of industrial relations, especially also because the CJEU has promoted above all and fairly systematically the freedom to provide services, so market freedoms, and has used it to undermine collective bargaining at the national level. There's also a French school arguing that social Europe is dangerous, historians and sociologists arguing that the EU is fundamentally a neoliberal project based on the four freedoms, on neoliberal thinking, and that it was promoted above all by the US also from outside. So the European community is a product to a large extent of American foreign policy. And the role of Jacques Delors, who was Commission President from 84 to 1994, he's sometimes, presented as the golden age, as the father of social Europe. Actually, a number of scholars showed that he was definitely a figure of social liberalism, and served an ideology of what the French call the second left, which also is to a large extent in tune with market interests and financial globalization. There's also an English school arguing that social Europe is an impossible dream. In that school, you can see here the picture of Paul Copeland at Queen Mary and Mary Daly at Oxford. Also, David Bailey argue, well, there's the fundamental bias towards market making, and that can hardly be addressed under the current circumstances. Other colleagues have taken a Lexit position in the Brexit debate, saying, well, the EU is neoliberal. So actually, if political control, democratic control is regained, then from a social policy making point of view, the UK may be even better off outside the EU. This was argued notably by Chris Bickerton and Richard Tuck. Finally, there's an Amsterdam school, which is very much rooted in transnational historical materialism. Actually, they're neo-Gramscians. They look at the restructuring of capitalism through EU integration. And they argue that the EU embodies a hegemonic project serving the interests of multinational corporations. So let me perhaps to conclude in 5 minutes, just touch upon the three scenarios. What to do, depending on whether you believe that social Europe is either irrelevant, catching up, or dangerous. Of course, you would come to different conclusions as to what should be done looking forward. So the first scenario is the one of a minimal social Europe, the German school, but also a lot of observers and political and social actors in Scandinavia are more defensive. They're in a defensive position. EU social policy making should be curtailed. The Court of Justice of Luxembourg should not have competencies on social issues, should not be able to undermine national social models. Even Schaap and others argued that the EMU should be to a large extent deconstructed, that this was, the crux of the matter, and that the EMU, the common currency, was incompatible with a social market economy. Ben Crum at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam argued that the EU has negative duties in social policy, that it should just offer equal opportunities for all in the single market from an economic and social perspective, but that it should, above all, tolerate and preserve the various national models without even seeking to transform them. Scenario 2 is one of a further building up of social Europe. And here, we see a number of academics. You see here a picture of Maurizio Ferreira at the bottom, and at the top, this is a picture of Frank van den Broeke, who has now actually recently become again a minister in Belgium. He's health minister now. And around them, there's a larger group, which I call the Belgo-Dutch Italian school. Of course, people are not determined by their origin. I just came up with these labels to try and bring some order. But the common feature among these scholars is that there is their proximity to the EU institutions. They're working a lot in EU-funded research projects. Bart van Erck is actually the director of the European Social Observatory in Brussels, who is working a lot for the European Commission. And these people have played a role of academic advisors through their researches and their assessments. And the perspective that they've been defending, notably through this book, A European Social Union After the Crisis, is one of the EU as a supporting environment for national welfare states. So the build-up should only go as far as to tackle negative externalities in the single market, for instance, social dumping. So we should regulate further the free circulation of workers to make sure there's no social dumping. And the EU should also provide stabilization instruments to stabilize national economies and stabilize the monetary union. And they have put forward, for instance, Laszlo Andor, who was a commissioner for social and for employment and social affairs in the second Barroso Commission, has put forward the idea of a European unemployment insurance scheme, a fund where a kind of European pot where all countries would put some money in, and when some countries in economic downturns know a very bad increase of their unemployment levels, they could use the money, the common money in that pot to tackle their issues. So basically, this was really coming out from the 2009-2010 recession. Anton Hemmerich, for instance, a Dutch scholar, really focused on social investment and advocates that the EU should help and turn itself into a social investment state, but should help the member states to transform their welfare states into social investment states. And I'm glad to talk more about social investment in the questions. Finally, scenario 3 is a major overhaul of the EU and of social Europe in particular. And here we find scholars that I would define, and you see I included myself in that first group, that I would call the Keynesian, like Philippe Pochet, also Colin Crouch, published recently an article saying that the EU needs to drop the neoliberal paradigm, needs to drop, for instance, unemployed activation, fiscal discipline, that all that has led nowhere but to a recommodification of social services, of social activities, and of workers. So there is a need to turn again towards demand-side policies and decommodification of workers and social protection. A group of colleagues in Paris around Thomas Piketty and Antoine Vaucher have put forward a new treaty proposal that they call the TDEM, Dem for Democracy, where a central proposal was the creation of a parliament of the Eurozone. And this parliament would have key competencies in socioeconomic issues, and it would even challenge the independence of the European Central Bank. So you can see that here the reform proposals are very far-reaching. Lastly, some go even further, and I call them Habermasians because they believe that there should be a more supranational buildup of redistributive capacities at European level. For instance, and those people are often, and you see that I included myself once again in this group, you may think, well, this is all, unthinkable utopia. But meanwhile, the idea of a child guarantee has been almost funded through the recovery package, and we're expecting a Commission proposal this year. Of course, a much more utopian and perhaps not desirable. I mean, there's a lot of debates about this, is the idea of having a European basic income. This has been put forward by Philippe Van Parijs and Frank van der Borge. And of course, that's not been really picked up whatsoever by the EU institutions. And finally, also, this, of course, would imply to strengthen the normative foundations of transnational solidarity. Why do we need to do more social policy in common? So I will stop here. I think, Louisa, my speaking time is over. I'm happy to stop here and take questions if there are any. And I want to thank you for your attention.